Recording. And we're recording in the cloud so that you can grab it.
Okay, all I have to do is get to it.
You hit record too, Joe.
I did.
Okay, good.
But I have to get that tech.
Take your time.
Okay, I think this share screen. Okay, I think.
All right, so let's let the people in.
Oh no, hold on. I got some type of a Zoom marketing thing. What is Zoom doing to me?
Joe, do you want me to let these people in or no?
Oh yeah, keep them busy for a while, okay?
Okay, you want to start it and then I'll take over.
I say, what do you want to start it and go and introduce, explain the
Yep, we'll do.
all the good stuff.
Okay, we have 31 in the waiting room. So can you start it or you want me to?
You go ahead and start it.
All right. How do I do that? I don't know that you put me on as a producer, did you?
Yeah, I did.
No, it's not giving me the option to start. All right.
Yeah.
Are we live? I'm going to admit them in. Go ahead, take care of what you're doing, Joe.
Yep. I have to go back into my email.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can we get a thumbs up that you're hearing me okay? We welcome you. Joe is currently working with our guest, working out some technical issues with Apple. I'm on an Apple, so I can't say too much. But before we start, I just want to go through, first welcome you all, and thank you for taking the time to join us today, but also go through some housekeeping issues. Looks like we're going to have a pretty good crowd today, so I'd ask you to remain muted on your mic if you would. If you're comfortable with it, it's always great to see you on camera, if possible. And thank you, Richard, Robert, Jesse. And we're going to keep allowing everyone in from the waiting room. If you will use the raise your hand option, we can work in the Q&A, and we certainly encourage a lively Q&A once George has presented his primary presentation. So we thank you all. Maybe in the chat, if you have time before we start, and as I said, Joe's working out some technical stuff right now. Excuse me. Could you just let me know where you're joining us from so we have an idea of geographic spread of the mix of our guests today? That would be great. Texas, excellent. Thank you, Jen. Minneapolis, Montreal. There you go, Joe. We got your open. Houston. Okay. Make sure everyone is allowed in. Of course, New Jersey, the Gardoon State, Dayton, Ohio, home of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Atlanta, Georgia. So we've got people from all over the country, and of our international guest from Canada, from Montreal. We'll be starting with George Hansen here in just a second. George is taking the master control seat. I'm going to turn everything over to Joe to do the formal introduction and kick off the meeting. And thank you much. Like I said, use the chat if you need it, and raise your hand if you'd like, or you can just put your question in chat. We'll be monitoring it, and we'll make sure we get to you. So we thank you all for joining us today, and we trust it'll be a valuable use of your time. I should say good morning, good afternoon. Well, I guess Texas, it's
Almost morning.
it's going over. Yeah, it's almost. It's going
Okay.
over there.
Yeah.
Joe, it's over to you, brother.
Hey, Bruce, thank you very much for filling in while we dealt with our technical issues. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're all here. We have a very good, very interesting presentation that George is going to be making. George Hansen is a well-established and well-respected researcher in the paranormal, and he has a very interesting presentation that he's going to be making today. With the short, because of the technical difficulties that we just had, I'm going to turn this over to George, and he's going to say hello. If he wants to say a little about himself first, George, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bruce and Joe. By way of introduction, I'm author of the book, The Trickster and the Paranormal. I worked full-time in parapsychology laboratories for 8 years. A small portion of my work was supported by the government psychic spying program, but none of my work was classified. Also, I've attended monthly meetings on UFOs for 3 decades. I was an official non-subscriber to Saucer Smear beginning in 1990 until it ceased publication. Smear was the most important chronicle of American ufology and was published for nearly 6 decades. Few cautions about this lecture. This lecture will be academic, scholarly, and abstract. This is not UFOs and the Paranormal 101. This is UFOs and the Paranormal 703. This graduate research seminar. Now, I will mention many names and book titles. I'll spend little or no time introducing them. I do not expect you to understand everything I say, and if you do, I've failed. But don't worry if you're not following something that I'm saying. I'll soon be on to another topic. I've got more than 100 slides today. This slide is primarily for ufologists. The field has many factions that hate each other. Most are oblivious to approaches other than their own, and this is much like academic psychology. So who influenced my thinking on ufology? Well, John Keel. I attended his meetings of the New York Fortean Society. Others included Martin Koppmeyer, the Magonia crowd, Jim Moseley, of course, Pat Marcatalio, Jacques Vallée, Dennis Stillings. Colin Bennett wrote books on Charles Fort, George Adamski, and Captain Ruppelt of Project Blue Book. That book on Ruppelt was dedicated to me, and it was titled An American Demonology. Colin Bennett was a postmodern ufologist, and he and I were banned from UFO updates for posting on postmodern issues. And I do hope that some of you at least remember that Bennett was writing about the military-industrial entertainment complex more than a decade before Tom DeLonge showed up. should say a few words about theory. My own perspective is deeply rooted in analyses of myth and ritual. But scientists generally consider myth to be fantasy, ritual, superstitious behavior, and they give them little attention. But for thousands of years, humans have used rituals to control, influence, and channel supernatural or paranormal forces. They have used myths to describe, explain, and understand those forces. But I will not discuss those today. Now, I do lecture sometimes on transgender and postmodernism in relation to UFOs. Some people think that's crazy, and I'd like to address that, especially for you techie people. I'll give you an analogy. Buildings and earthquakes, electrical circuits, and water flowing in pipes and reservoirs are governed by the same basic differential equations, equations I used to solve. Those equations are abstract representations, and they govern radically diverse systems. When a building is shaking, when water and current are flowing, those equations are operating, but you don't see them. For UFOs and psychic phenomena, I'm interested in those invisible relations. Now, I do find literary theory, semiotics, and anthropology highly relevant to theoretical work on UFOs. Also, I will point out that I'm not the only one to use trickster and liminality theory in analysis of social events. This book, Martyrs and Tricksters, came out 2 years ago. It discusses the 2011 revolution in Egypt. This book was published by Princeton University Press, and the author is a professor at Oxford. Now, here are the topics I'll be covering today. And this list seems to be something of a hodgepodge, but in each of these, we find connections between UFOs and the paranormal. I will inundate you with examples of those convergences. And I submit that any comprehensive theory of UFOs must explain the paranormal aspects. Historical examples are of real particular interest because of today's work in cliodynamics, and that's the mathematical modeling of historical processes. And I'll discuss that at the end. Now, there will be time for breaks and discussion, so don't worry if it gets a little bit overwhelming. The connections between UFOs, ETs, and spirits are not new. James Hislop was a professor at Columbia University, and he also served as president of the American Society for Psychical Research. The society produced several papers on a Mrs. Smead, the wife of a clergyman who reported communicating with Martians. An article in 1918 on her ran more than 700 pages. That topic was taken very seriously back then, but it was later dropped from parapsychology journals. The volume discussed the spiritistic theory in relation to these communications. For you ufologists, Gray Barker reprinted part of the Smead case in 1983. Barker was a trickster and a marginal character, but he was quite willing to discuss UFOs along with mediumship, unlike many respectable ufologists of his day. Now, Barker also achieved a bit of notoriety for penning the most famous poem in ufology. And the symbolism in that work is surprisingly consonant with anthropological theory. I will remind you that Barker is a noted figure in the history of the field, and today many of his papers and books are held by the Clarksburg, West Virginia Library. A better known historical case was that of Helene Smith, which was reported by Swiss psychologist Theodore Flournoy in his book From India to the Planet Mars. That was published 121 years ago. By the way, Flournoy was also involved with psychical research of his day, and he wrote Spiritism and Psychology. Andrew Jackson Davis has been called the John the Baptist of modern spiritualism. He was a medium, and in 1845 he clairvoyantly viewed Saturn and reported seeing its inhabitants. Going back further, we have Emmanuel Swedenborg. He was a scientist and inventor. The King of Sweden appointed him to a position with the Board of Mines. He was also a mystic and a clairvoyant. In fact, his clairvoyance was discussed by Immanuel Kant, the leading philosopher of his day. So more than 260 years ago, Swedenborg made astral journeys to other planets. He wrote a book about life on other planets and discussed the spirituality of aliens. But he also communicated with spirits of the dead a lot. By the way, Swedenborg's Foundation website has free PDFs of his works, and also in Bryn Athyn, Pennsylvania, which is in the northeast Philadelphia area, there's a Swedenborgian college and cathedral, and those are really worth visiting. Okay, let's look at some of the leading popular writers on paranormal topics. Sorry about the interruption. There are actually quite a number of writers who cover both UFOs and psychic phenomena. For instance, both Scott Rogo and John Fuller wrote on psychic topics and on UFOs. Fuller's books go back to the 1960s, Rogo's to the 1970s and 80s. By the way, Rogo contributed to professional level journals of parapsychology. Having a little technical issue here. We had it before. I don't know if we had all this shit up here. Okay. Okay, I think we're back on track. Jenny Randalls is one of the most respected people in the UFO field in the UK. She's also a trans woman, and some of her UFO books are shown here. Trying to do some more technical adjustments here. Can we make it big? It's better. We don't want two slides on at once.
There should be a little, like a little slide thing, which takes away the ruler at the top. And that will make the whole thing bigger.
Did you hear her?
Yes, George, your mic is open also, be advised.
Bruce, we're still having some technical difficulties here. Trying to do some sizing with the slides.
Yeah, as Chantal advised Joe that there is a slide that'll allow you to size the slide. We're seeing the writer's slide fine right now.
Yeah.
So there's no reason not to continue from the. Who's breathing in the mic here, folks? Okay, there's no reason not to continue from the audience standpoint as far as the slides, Joe.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Bruce.
Yes. You can continue, George.
Okay, I think there's quite a bit cut off on my screen now.
Well, Joe can scroll down for you.
You can go into the toolbar and go to full screen, and then it'll take a look.
That should bring.
Hold on, I can't do this, but I'll put you over to Joe.
Okay, I'm here.
Are you monitoring, Joe? Yeah, just go to the toolbar, as Chantal said, and go to full screen. Take your box and go full screen.
I got too much on the screen here.
Or you can scroll down
There
as
we
he
go.
discussed.
There we go.
Yeah, yeah. And you can scroll down if you want to roll down the screen with your mouse on the right. There you go. So
Okay, I can also resize
that's
it. There.
there.
That should do it.
Yep.
Okay, so. Just hit
And it'd
this
be helpful
button.
if you dial in on your phone and monitor so you can hear.
Okay, you should
Thanks.
be able to-
Yeah, hit this one.
You should have full screen now, George.
Okay, it's a bunch of some of it's cut off.
That's about the best.
Okay, we'll try to continue here. I was saying that Jenny Randles is one of the most respected people in the UFO field in the UK. She's also a trans woman. Some of her UFO books are shown here, but she's also written on psychic topics, as you can see here. Anne Druffel was a highly respected longtime ufologist. Some of her books are shown here, and she's written, as you can see, she's written on psychic topics. She has a rather interesting story. In 1945, 2 years before Kenneth Arnold's sighting, she saw a UFO in Long Beach, California, with clear blue skies. Her mother was also a witness. And they later realized that it was very close to the time of the first nuclear bomb test in New Mexico. Whitley Strieber is a best-selling author of many books, both fiction and nonfiction. He's especially well known for his UFO abduction experiences. His 1987 book, Communion, was on the New York Times bestseller list. And in the back of the book, Strieber put his mailing address, hoping to learn about others' experiences, expecting something like a few dozen letters. By 1992, he and his wife stopped counting at 200,000, and they estimated receiving about 500,000 letters by year 2000. Abduction experiences are far, far more common than people realize. But in the last few years, Strieber has described extensive contact with his deceased wife in his book, The Afterlife Revolution. So let's look at some writers who explicitly link UFOs and spirits. Uh, Nearly 30 years ago, psychologist Ken Ring documented many similarities between UFO and near-death experiences. The subtitle of his book makes the point: Near-death experiences, UFO encounters, and mind at large. Ring is one of the few academics who was willing to undertake such a study. Ray Fowler is a well-known ufologist. In 1995, he published The Watchers 2 with the subtitle Exploring UFOs and the Near-Death Experience. PMH Atwater is a psychic grandmother. Early in her life, she was a newspaper columnist in Idaho. She went on to become a very active researcher of near-death experiences and has written several books on them. And she reports, I only came across 2 near-death survivors who described an alien-type being as part of their near-death scenario. Yet, fully 1/3 of the people I interviewed began to see UFOs afterward. Stephen Greer has been a prominent and controversial figure in the UFO field for 30 years. He has a DVD on remote viewing, and he leads groups who try to contact ETs. And during some of those attempts, they encounter dead people, and they're very upfront about that. They admit that very readily. And Greer himself has reported a powerful near-death experience when he was 17 years old. Diana Pasulka is a professor of philosophy and religion. In 2014, she finished Heaven Can Wait: Purgatory in Catholic Devotional and Popular Culture. Purgatory, of course, is all about the afterlife, and her book discusses encounters with spirits. Pasulka well, was talking to a colleague one day who told her that some of the accounts that she found in her archival document research were very similar to UFO reports. And Pasulka went on to study UFOs and published a book on them 5 years later. Pasulka's had considerable contact with the intelligence agencies, and there's little doubt that she's involved with some of the government's education program on UFOs, and some of her podcasts have been censored. Pasulka also wrote this article, From Purgatory to the UFO Phenomenon, the Catholic Supernatural Goes Galactic. The cover of that book has a photo of a seance with a levitating chair. Now, many books link UFOs and the paranormal. This is not a new effort. Let me give you some early examples. More than half a century ago, the U.S. Air Force requested that the Library of Congress prepare a bibliography on UFOs. That bib included 5 pages on psychic aspects of UFOs. The title of Jacques Vallée's UFOs, the Psychic Solution explicitly links UFOs and psychic phenomena. Richard Haynes worked for NASA, and he has done extensive research on UFOs, but he keeps a rather low public profile. But he is highly respected within the field. 42 years ago, he edited this book, UFO Phenomena and the Behavioral Scientist. And in his prologue, he wrote, "It is becoming increasingly clear to some of us who are looking at the bizarre reports from clearly credible UFO eyewitnesses that it may well be this so-called spirit dimension that makes the phenomenon so difficult to take seriously." Richard Belzer is a comedian and an actor on the TV show Law and Order. He has an interest in paranormal topics. His book, UFOs, JFK, and Elvis, was published in 1999. Well, 9 years earlier, at a Parapsychological Association convention, I presented Demons, ETs, Bigfoot, and Elvis. These topics go together. So I've been thinking about such convergences for more than 30 years. Eric Olette teaches at the Canadian Forces College. He made a direct attempt to integrate ufology into parapsychology. The subtitle of his book is The UFO Experience as a Parapsychological Event. One of Ouellette's colleagues is Susan Demeter, a self-identified witch who is half of a paranormal power couple. Her forthcoming book has the subtitle UFOs, Social Psi, and Magic. Dr. Teodorani is a professor of astrophysics. He has written on synchronicity and has done a fair amount of UFO research. This is an important book. Håkan Blomqvist is co-founder and chairman of the board of the Archives for the Unexplained. The AFU is perhaps the world's most important repository of works on the paranormal. His book can be downloaded at the URL shown here. It's 461 pages and it is free. Barry Taff worked with Thelma Moss at UCLA in the 1970s. He later wrote the book Aliens Above, Ghosts Below. He was one of the major figures in the Entity case, which was made into a 1983 movie. Jeffrey Mishlove has the new Thinking Aloud YouTube channel. It's one of the most sophisticated conveying and covering paranormal topics. Mishlove conducted a 10-year study of Ted Owens, who displayed massive psychokinesis. Owens wrote a book, How to Contact Space People. Nancy Dutertre is an attorney specializing in securities and corporate law. She's a Princeton graduate and also a medium. And 46 years after Owens' book, she published How to Talk to an Alien. A few more writers who have covered the UFO and paranormal areas are shown here. And here. And there are many more. I'd like to highlight a bit of the career of Ray Stanford, who has had an extraordinary life. I don't know if many of you know, but Ray is the identical twin of Rex Stanford, one of the most highly respected researchers within professional parapsychology. Ray is a psychic who has made substantial contributions to paleontology. In fact, he was honored by the Smithsonian for that. Ray was also one of the main investigators of the Socorro case in 1964. Government personnel stole a metal sample that he had found, and he's documented that. By the way, he's also written a book about Fatima, a case I'll discuss later. The Socorro case takes on renewed interest with the publication of the new Valet-Harris book, Trinity, which is a very important contribution to the field. The red star in this illustration marks the location of the Trinity site, the first nuclear explosion. Roswell is off to the east in this diagram, Corona at the north, and please note that San Antonio and Socorro are two of the closest towns to the Trinity site. This provides something of a link between UFOs and nukes. There's a lot more of it, many more links in that direction, of course, but this is quite striking. And the book, the Trinity book by Valet and Harris, goes into some very detailed testimony that seems quite convincing, and it's a case that had long been kind of neglected, but the evidence seems very, very strong indeed. Here's a little closer. I think Valet reported that the actual crash site for the San Antonio case was about 8 miles from the Trinity site. Socorro is maybe maybe double that, but still really quite close. The Socorro area is also of interest because in the 1600s there was a nun from Spain who was seen in Mexico, in New Mexico area. And the Indians there came and sought out some of the missionaries and reported seeing her. And she converted many of the Indians. The Inquisition looked into the case and determined that she almost certainly had bilocated to the Socorro area, among other spots. Diana Pasulka covers this case briefly in her book. So there may be something about location here that's quite important that we don't understand yet. Now, as an aside, I'll mention that we sometimes found the explicit UFO spirit connection in folk art. Retablos are devotional paintings, especially small folk art ones using iconography derived from traditional Catholic Church art. Here's one from Andrew Chestnut's site. Chestnut is an authority on Santa Muerte, or Saint Death. Let's zoom in. Let's see if I can get that. The note says here, we were invaded by UFOs and the Virgin took care of us and nothing happened. Here's another. That other time that the Virgin of Guadalupe saved the townsfolk from outer space sea monkeys. Really quite odd, but really striking that we have reports from modern day Americans rather similar to something that happened in a very different part of the country or the world. Zoom in a little bit more. Those are very odd creatures. Okay, in recent years, with print on demand, there has been a growing number of authors who have become publishers. And this is an especially important group because these people live and work among paranormal subcultures. Their livelihoods depend on understanding those subcultures and associated experiences. And unlike academics, they rarely, if ever, express any kind of sneering or condescending attitude toward experiencers. The late Tim Beckley was a longtime publisher, editor, and writer in ufology. But he also wrote on spiritualism, for instance, his book on the Davenport brothers, his book David Bowie, UFOs, Witchcraft, Cocaine, and Paranoia, shows that those topics go together. Tim had a lot of firsthand experience with the fringe of the fringe. He's also made some wonderful movies such as Sandy Hook Lingerie Party Massacre, and he has appeared in 50 cinematic masterpieces such as Barely Legal Lesbian Vampires. Now, you may laugh, and that's okay, but I've been on his podcasts, and frankly, one was the best I've ever been on. He and his colleagues really understood the trickster in their bones. By the way, Beckley's recent book, Alien Lives Matter, has a chapter by our own Joe Foster. Patrick Huish runs Anomalous Books, a publisher on paranormal topics. He's also an author. His website, anomalous.com, is an important portal for paranormal topics, and it's updated on a daily basis. The late Rosemary Guiley was one of the most prolific authors on the paranormal, writing something like 65 books herself, and she published books by others. Richard Dolan is one of the most prominent figures within ufology. He's also a publisher. For instance, Mike Clelland's book on owls is all about synchronicities. Robbie Graham is a relative newcomer to publishing. His background is primarily in UFOs, but he publishes a wider range of topics, as you can see here. Now, I'm making a point by covering all these writers and publishers. UFO and psychic phenomena are connected at some deep fundamental level, and we need to understand the characteristics of the overlaps, and that includes the people and institutions involved with both. Any comprehensive theory of the paranormal must also accommodate UFO phenomena, and any comprehensive theory of UFOs must address paranormal aspects. Now, there are a few periodicals that cover both topics. Fate magazine, of course, covers both of them, as well as other fringe matters. Fate was owned by Kurt and Mary Fuller, then Carl Weschke, and then Phyllis Galdi, but never by a large corporation. The owners had a strong personal interest in the topics. Fortean Times is another that covers spiritualism, UFOs, and related matters, as does Skeptical Inquirer. Now, more than 30 years ago, the SSE began a journal which covers parapsychology, UFOs, and other topics considered marginal by the mainstream. The scientific quality of this journal does not come close to that of the Journal of Parapsychology, but to its considerable credit, the journal and the magazine are both open access. Anyone can download all the issues for free. The magazine, by the way, is edited by Patrick Huige of Anomalous Books. Well, I think that might be time for a break, and I will let the moderators take over.
Oh, thank you very much. A fascinating presentation, George. What we're going to do now, and we generally do this at each of these monthly conferences, we take questions and comments from the folks out there in the audience. So, Bruce, you want to monitor? We also will take any text messages that you would like presented to the speaker. And the comments, we'll take them one at a time. Wait your turn. Everybody will have a shot. Also, just to let you know, at the last half hour, we will have a final question and answer period. And I'm sure George will be more than happy to discuss any of the issues. If there's anything you're interested in, leave a text message and Bruce and I will monitor it. And if appropriate, and if we have the information, we'll text it back to you during the presentation as it's going on. Okay, anybody in the audience would like to ask a question of George?
Yes, Farusha is got his hand up, and please unmute and go ahead with your question.
Hi, George.
Hello,
Farusha.
Farusha. Good to see you.
I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
No, not he, but doesn't
Unique name. Forgive me.
no problem. I have one short question and one long question. I'm going to start with the longer question, and that is that, and this is something that you're very familiar with, George. It seems to me like maybe the quote unquote aliens, whoever they might be, are certainly maybe tricksters, as you so clearly say. And when you think that you see your grandmother, and it even sounds like your grandmother, it may just be an entity who is neither an alien nor your grandmother. And that's sort of like the first thing that I wanted to say and question you about. And the second thing is very short, so I'll mention it at the same time. And that is Rex and Ray Stanford. Do you know if they're regular identical twins or if they're chimera twins, identical twins, which means that, there's the mirror image of one another, which would make some kind of difference in their mutual psychology?
First of all, regarding the Stanford brothers, I don't know the answer to the question. It's a very good question, and I hope we will find out sometime. They're both still alive, to the best of my knowledge.
Yes.
Regarding your first question, yes, you have asked a very, very important question. I will be discussing a little bit of that later on in my presentation, and I think it really deserves extensive discussion, perhaps even at the end of the lecture. But thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Okay, who is next? Do we have a hand? Do we have, or just say your name and make your statement or your comment or your question. Any hands, Bruce?
No, not at this point. I have a question for George, if I may. George, you did not, unless I missed it, you did not discuss Christopher O'Brien. And as you are focusing on the trickster aspect of your investigations, I know Christopher, he wrote a book called Stalking the Trickster, based on a great deal of research he did in the San Luis Valley up in Colorado, the Alpine Valley. Are you aware of him? Do you have any comments on that? Have you read the book, and so on and so forth?
Well, I certainly know Chris. It's been a long time since we've had any contact, but yes, I very much respect his work. I also lived out in Colorado, but not down where he lived. And I take his work very, very seriously. I'm not, I'd have to go back and look if he's written anything exclusively on paranormal topics, but certainly the cattle mutilation stuff overlaps in some very, very interesting ways. And there's certain aspects of mythology that would address that as well. So he, and I've also been in contact with his colleague David Perkins over the years. So Chris
Right.
O'Brien is a very important researcher.
Okay, I just, you had not mentioned him, and also, he worked extensively with Linda Howe, and I've known Linda from back in the 70s in New Mexico. So I was wondering how that dovetailed with your research. That's all. Thank you, sir.
Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question. I can't figure out how to raise my hand. Hey, George, how you doing?
Hello, Steve.
Hey, listen, I'm just curious, is text itself a paranormal phenomena? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm going to address that obliquely later on a bit. The whole issue of language and meaning and hermeneutics all ties into this at very fundamental levels. And you ask a very profound question, and I'm not quite prepared to address that effectively today, but it is certainly something I've been thinking about in roundabout ways for some years. So thank you for asking. It's an important one.
We have a question from Michael Redmond. Michael, if you want to unmute and ask your question, go ahead, sir.
Oh, hello, George.
Hello, Michael.
In what ways were Diane Pasulka's podcasts censored? You said that in passing, and I was curious to know more.
Yes, I don't know if they were complete. I've got two sources on that. I think they may have been repeated. They couldn't tell her what was being censored, so they took it off, and I think they redid it. But I've got two sources, two completely independent sources on that.
George, I'll read a question that came in from Bruce Cornett, and I think it's an interesting question, and that is, can you discuss the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah and how that may or may not be part and parcel with your investigations of the trickster?
Okay, very, very good question. I'll be discussing that under the label the intelligence agencies. So yes, it's a very important question. That's a very important case from a variety of perspectives. So thank you for asking.
Thank you, Bruce.
Okay, this is Joe Foster. I noticed that some of the comments that are going back and forth, Pasulka, a couple of folks alluded to the fact that some view her as a fraud. Do you know why that would be, or?
No, I don't think Diana is a fraud at all. I think she was quite naive. She was almost clearly recruited very early on. And I think she was probably psychologically profiled at a meeting in the Philadelphia area. She is an ideal spokesperson, but she had very little background in the field. And I have seen no reason to think she would do anything fraudulent. She is, though, I would say, naive, and her book is very interesting. It's certainly not an academic work, even though Oxford University Press presents it as so. This raises questions: who edited the book? What pressures were put on? Our local group has had extended presentations on this. Michael Redmond, who just spoke a few minutes ago, was involved with that. The Pasulka case is extraordinarily interesting. And I think in her personal life, there has been some serious fallout for her involvement in these topics. These phenomena affect people's personal lives in some very deep ways. And people need to understand that, and that's part of the dangers of dealing with this. I often say there are real reasons that Catholic priests, monks, and nuns are not allowed to marry, and there are good reasons for that. And it has to do with the nature of these phenomena.
Thank you, George. It looks like this thread could go on and on and on, but I don't think we'd be able to go too much into the whys and hows. So any other questions out there at this point?
Yes, Joe, there's one that came in from Lance Foster, and I'll read it. Will you be discussing how the paranormal / trickster uses the internet as a route of connection or action? Not indirectly, but directly, though not through articles, podcast spokespeople, but actual phenomena?
I'd have to think about that. Certainly the internet has a very tricksterish aspect and a liminal aspect. Um, I'm not really prepared to address that effectively today. It's a very important question, and there will be aspects that I will touch upon that bear on that topic. It's a little difficult to get into the details here, but thank you for asking. It's an important issue.
Hey, George.
Identify yourself, please.
Oh, Steve.
Hi, Steve. Thank you.
Can I just say something really quick, George? I think Neuromancer, Gibson's first book, was all about the trickster and the web. I mean, really connecting it, and that's just an important, that's old school, but that's an important one for people who are interested in that. And a lot of the kind of ideas about the internet, blah, 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 come from that in a lot of ways. And that was early enough. So anyway, I'll shut up.
Okay, thank you for your comment, Steve.
Yeah, Steve, this is Joe Foster. I tend to agree that, there's a lot of interesting connectivity between, it looks like social media, the internet, and tricksterism, if you will.
Have you read Neuromancer?
No, I haven't.
And read Neuromancer.
Okay, I will take that under advisement. Thank you.
Do we have another one? Yeah, Michael Redmond would like to jump in. Go ahead and unmute and go. You're next, Michael.
George, most of the reviews that I've seen of Vallet's Trickster have been very negative. And I'm interested that you think highly of the book. Why do you think highly of the book, and why do you think it has taken such flack?
Well, I think there are people out there, bloggers and whatnot, who are paid, who there is a real rollout on the UFO topic across all media. So I suspect that some of these people would probably not want to have this book so publicized. That's just, maybe a little bit conspiratorial thinking, but there's enough of that going around to take that seriously.
Okay, thank you, George. Okay, we're just about approaching the 3 o'clock hour. So this was the first of we're going to be scheduled 2 more breaks. So I'm going to suggest that we move on into the second section right now, which is technology and intelligence agencies. So this should be a very interesting component. It should generate a lot more comments and questions and concerns. George, it's all yours.
Thank you. Okay, the topic now is technology. Until recently, I hadn't given much thought to the paranormal and technology. But in the last 20 years or so, there's been a growing academic literature on the topic. And it shows up in some rather surprising places. To give just one example, the December 2019 issue of the Leonardo Music Journal. It carried the title, Summerland, Exploring the Intersection of Spiritualism and Technology at the Dawn of the Electrical Age. Something you wouldn't normally think would go together. Eric Davis's book, Technosis, is significant and quite readable. This index indicates that magic is discussed. The index of the book shows that magic is discussed on 19 pages. There is a full chapter on aliens and UFOs and 8 pages on spiritualism. And Davis draws on mythology and discusses Hermes, the Greek trickster god, in relationship to technology. Please note that this Eric Davis is the first name is spelled with a K, and he's not to be confused with the Eric Davis, the physicist, who's prominent in UFO research. Jason Giorgiani is another scholar writing on technology and the paranormal. He also draws on mythology, specifically Prometheus, another trickster. The first page of the introduction discusses Prometheus's relation to technology. The book index lists more than 20 pages for ghosts, more than 40 for UFOs, and more than 60 pages for ESP. Richard Kiekeffer is a noted scholar of magic. He pointed out that even in the Middle Ages, it was recognized that magic, use of paranormal power, had connections to technology. Spiritualism certainly attracted techie types. All three of these were members of the Society for Psychical Research. All of them attended seances. Sirs Crooks and Lodge helped develop radio technology. Both served as president of the Society for Psychical Research. Watson was Alexander Graham Bell's assistant when he was 22 years old. There's a huge amount more that could be said, but we need to turn to UFOs and technology. Diana Pasulka's book, subtitle, emphasizes that theme. But we also see some connections to paranormal phenomena here. She wrote, a number of individuals from aeronautic agencies had contacted me about my historical work on levitating saints. There have been quite a number of people involved with aviation or aerospace and the paranormal. This is a list I came up without spending very much time. You may recognize some of these names. I'm sure there are considerably more. The last person on this list, Swedenborg, was designing flying machines in 1714. That's more than 300 years ago. Another person I can't remember, I don't think I put him on, Orfeo Angelucci, who's a Jersey boy, worked for one of the aerospace companies, and a very noted experiencer back many years ago. Technology entrepreneurs have been some of the most important funders of scientific paranormal research. Outside of the intelligence agencies, James McDonnell was probably the biggest funder of psychic research in the U.S. in the last 40 years. James McDonnell and Robert Bigelow supported both parapsychology and UFO research. And it's been said that McDonnell had an interest in talking with dead test pilots. Robert Bigelow's company prominently features an alien logo, and since December 2017, he's gained a lot of media coverage. Russia, we see this in Russia in the mid-1800s, this connection. Connections between technology, mysticism, the paranormal, and space travel. George Young's book, The Russian Cosmos, provides heavy documentation of this. Others are also writing on the matter. For instance, this article, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and the Occult Roots of Soviet Space Travel. Well, next on our syllabus are the intelligence agencies. And I submit that you cannot understand ufology without significant background on psychic spying. There is an extraordinary overlap between the government's UFO program and psychics. This link can be traced back more than 70 years, 7 decades, longer than most of us have been alive. From publicly available material, I put together a list of some of the individuals involved with both UFOs and government psychic spying programs, and there are others not included here. When Uri Geller was being tested at Stanford Research Institute, Jacques Vallée was stationed on a tower to watch for UFOs. That was nearly half a century ago. By the way, Vallée has also published research on remote viewing, and Geller has reported contact with UFOs. Ingo Swann taught many of the U.S. government psychic spies. He wrote a number of books on psychic topics, as well as on apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary, a spiritual being, and on UFOs. He had UFO encounters himself. He certainly saw spirits, and he hired me to do a ghost investigation of his building. Joseph McMoneagle and Lynn Buchanan are two well-known government remote viewers. Both have had UFO experiences, and Buchanan has reported abduction experiences. But the connection goes back much earlier. In the late 1940s, Colonel Howard McCoy was involved with the government study of UFOs. And several years ago, Michael Swords went through McCoy's files and found a document showing military testing of Eileen Garrett. Garrett was one of the most well-known mediums of the time. Swords' document shows that government UFO researchers were interested in mediumship more than 7 decades ago. The case of Helen Duncan is instructive regarding psychic spying. During World War II, she conducted seances, and she came in contact with a dead sailor. Except she wasn't supposed to know about him. The Germans had actually sunk a British ship, but they didn't realize that they had done so. And it was strategically important for the British that the Germans remain ignorant of the sinking. Seems likely American intelligence service would have been made aware of the situation. Duncan was attacked, debunked, discredited, and put in prison precisely because she provided accurate psychic information. She was a threat to national security. But attempts at psychic spying are not new. John Boucher is a leading historian of spiritualism, and he discovered an account of medium John Spear conveying a message from Benjamin Franklin 6 days before the beginning of the Civil War. The message from the medium said, "Let it now be supposed that there is a desire to become acquainted with the Russian method of polishing iron. It is a secret. A person may, when asleep, travel to Russia from the center of the United States in about 30 minutes. Boucher commented that this must be the first case of attempted industrial espionage by Americans on Russians via remote viewing. And Boucher went on to describe attempts of spiritualist psychic spying during the Civil War. The military and the intelligence agencies are focused not only on threats from other countries, they also act to shape public opinion. And Robbie Graham has done an important book on that. He's also published an academic paper on the topic. Graham wrote a particularly interesting article for MysteriousUniverse.org about NBC's Dark Skies series. A government agent crashed a private party for the cast. The agent knew many details of the planned series and made suggestions for future episodes. The intelligence community has spent considerable money to influence popular culture. That is, you and me. As most of you probably know, a landmark article appeared in the New York Times on December 16, 2017. The case involved a encounter with a UFO in 2004. One of the writers on that story was Leslie Kean, whose family is part of the political aristocracy of New Jersey. Kean has also written books on UFOs and on life after death. Now, 3 years prior to the New York Times story, her name appeared in John Podesta's emails, which were later released by WikiLeaks. The emails reveal that the writers of the story were being selected 3 years in advance of the story's release. Those writers did not ask any hard questions. Their required role was that of shill, not investigative reporter. Now, the primary narrative promoted today is that only 20 years ago, or thereabouts, a small group of dedicated public servants, such as Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, and Harry Reid, became concerned about the UFO issue. This, of course, is an intentionally deceptive narrative. The media frenzy today is very nicely choreographed. This is a photo from 1973, almost half a century ago. These are some of the major characters in the government's psychic spying program. Puthoff and Green are still publicly prominent today for their work in both remote viewing and on UFOs. Hal Puthoff makes appearances on History Channel's Unidentified and other TV shows. Russell Targ was central to the recent documentary Third Eye Spies. There is informed speculation that Pratt Price was murdered because of his psychic abilities. Now, 2 years ago, Jacques Vallée published his volume 4 of his Forbidden Science Diary, and it's quite an expose. He raises serious questions about the honesty of Christopher Kit Green, MD, CIA. He's been involved with government remote viewing projects and UFO research for 5 decades. Green also served as chairman of an advisory committee for Robert Bigelow. Vallee's revelations are simply devastating for Green's credibility. Now, Contact in the Desert is one of the biggest annual UFO conventions. It's scheduled for later this month. It has a session on remote viewing. Russell Targ is one of the speakers, and 5 of the 7 people here are rather well known within parapsychology. A number of intelligence agencies have funded paranormal research. The DIA is one of them. Some of its money went to Bigelow Aerospace. The public doesn't have much access to detailed technical reports, but 3 years ago, BAAS issued a statement of some interest. It read, "The UFO phenomenon was a lot more than nuts and bolts machines. It referred to activity that included bizarre creatures, poltergeist activity, invisible entities, orbs of light, animal and human mutilations." It went on to note the increasing evidence of deception and subterfuge by the UFO phenomenon. The UFO phenomenon was capable of manipulating and distorting human perception and therefore eyewitness testimony of UFO activity, and was becoming increasingly untrustworthy. Fits very nicely with trickster theory today. That's a little bit beyond our scope, but one of our previous questions kind of nailed it before I got to it. Okay, it's time for a break.
Okay, we've got another break here. Who would like to make a comment? I noticed a lot of conversation on the chat side. Would we care to ask any questions of George on the topics that he's just covered? It's a fascinating array of areas that do overlap, obviously, and I think it is a fertile ground for comment and questions. Questions, please. Any hands raised?
I'll go if nobody has one.
Okay, Steve, go ahead.
George, Tahuti, Thoth, and Asclepius, and all that talk about text and memory and things like that. Have you gone into that yet, or?
I have. I don't think I published anything on that, but I've certainly looked at some of that.
And the Norbert Wiener Kabbalistic angle, Norbert Wiener is I have a friend who has some of his archive, and there's a bunch of Norbert Wiener Kabbalist stuff, which ties kind of tightly into text. So tech and text and paranormal. I don't know, just asking.
No, thanks. I was not aware of that. I much appreciate that lead. Thank you.
And can you talk about Pasulka, George? If nobody else is asking a question, I find it really abhorrent what she does. I was at the Guggenheim when she spoke with that guy from Moon Soup, which I felt was like the most horrible thing I've ever seen, and not, vapid and dumb. So who do you think this Tyler is? Can you speak about that? I hate even giving her any attention.
Tyler, the real name of Tyler D's real name is Timothy Taylor. She's published that years ago. In fact, you could find it on one of her websites. That she came right out and said it, identified him very, very clearly. He wrote the book Launch Fever, if you want to follow up on that.
So is he a Silicon Valley guy, or is he just some?
No, he's a very interesting character. The book Launch Fever goes into that. It's an autobiographical work, and he's invented things. He started businesses. He's a pretty impressive guy in some ways. So I recommend, if you want to follow it up, get Launch Fever.
Okay, it looks like a fertile area for more research. Steve, you're selected. Okay, any other questions? Comments? Any linkages that you might see that may not have been directly addressed today?
Yeah, I'd be curious at what Steve was mentioning about the Kabbalistic connections there, because I didn't quite catch the name. So if you could type.
Was it Farusha?
The Steve had mentioned
Norbert Wiener, Weiner.
Norman Wiener.
Norbert.
Oh, Norbert Wiener.
Oh yeah, and George, just so you know, Matty Ostrowski is a good friend of mine.
I don't know who that is.
He wrote the Summerland book you referenced.
Oh, okay.
And Matty just has a great piece of Morse code machines tapping out spiritualist doctrine. It's a great piece, like 50 Morse code machines in a room tapping out in Morse code translations of spiritualist doctrine. It's really great. Matty's a good guy in Greenpoint.
George, I have a question here. That just brought to mind the Bible code, and have you looked at the linkages between the Bible code when they run it through a supercomputer, and the messages that come out?
I have looked at some of the articles. I think one in a statistical journal. I was very unimpressed. I didn't find anything to take very seriously. However, there were some very interesting reports of the author of that book interacting with Ron Pandolfi.
Oh, really?
I think, I can't remember the details, but there were some very peculiar aspects there.
The gentleman was a mathematician, I believe, wasn't he, or a computer programmer?
The one who wrote the book, I'm not sure was. I can't remember. There were some very peculiar connections, though, with all this. But the claims of the Bible code itself seemed totally unconvincing from what I read. And that was quite a few years
Like
ago.
take 1,000 monkeys and
Yeah.
throw them into typewriters and
Something on that.
George, one last question, if I could
Yeah,
ask.
Yes, go ahead.
What have you read? I really did like it. The new Making Contact, Alan Steinfeld's new book. Have you checked into that?
I've only looked at the contents on like Google Books or Amazon.
It's an interesting take in this kind of meta way to the overview of it. I really was. I was, because I'm reading Colin Wilson's Alien Dawn. It's horrible. It's just like a litany of incidents. But Alan's book actually stepped outside of the box, I thought. I really did. And I was surprised. So I wonder if you had read it yet. Thanks, George.
Nope, have not.
Bruce Cornett, I noticed you made a comment, Launch Fever by Timothy Tyler. Could you care to expand on that a little?
I was just writing it down for everybody to remember it, since it was not posted on George's slides.
Yeah, actually, it is. I have his name. It's Timothy Taylor, not
Okay,
Timothy Tyler.
Oh,
okay.
right. That was mentioned. Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Okay, George, I think maybe we can move along.
Okay. Next on our syllabus is deconstruction. This is the realm of theory. Don't worry if you don't get what I'm talking about. I've done a whole lecture just introducing the concept, but I hope you'll pay a little attention to the terminology. You might be a little more alert when you encounter it elsewhere. But deconstruction has massive implications for the paranormal and for UFOs. But the theory is highly abstract. The founder of deconstruction was French philosopher Jacques Derrida. If you have an academic background in the humanities or social sciences, you're probably a bit familiar with him. Otherwise, you're probably not. At the end of the 20th century, he was probably the most influential living philosopher. As some of you know, French philosophy is heavily influenced by Karl Marx. In 1993, Derrida published Spectres of Marx. This work was written in response to the book The End of History and the Last Man by the eminent neocon Francis Fukuyama. Fukuyama's was a work of political philosophy, and with the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the USSR, Fukuyama extolled the triumph of Western liberal democracy. Derrida took sharp issue and wrote Spectres of Marx. So, why is this book of any relevance to us here? The answer? Because this book is by far, today's most influential academic work on ghosts. Google Scholar reports that Spectres of Marx has received more than 12,000 citations. I will point out that in this book, the words spirit or spirits appear more than 230 times. The words ghost or ghosts more than 350 times. He cites spiritualists and their dancing tables and mentions revenants, conjuring, exorcisms, as well as Victor Hugo's seances. This book introduced the term hauntology, a near homonym of ontology. So here we have a book on political philosophy that is highly relevant to the paranormal. It's been entirely ignored within parapsychology. In 1981, Derrida published an essay on telepathy. but like specters of Marx, it's been almost universally ignored within parapsychology. But also in 1981, Karl Raschke, a scholar of Derrida, published UFOs, Ultra-Terrestrial Agents of Cultural Deconstruction. It's one of the most insightful ever published on UFOs, and it has been ignored by virtually all ufologists. In one of my lectures, I've explained how spiritualism is also an agent of deconstruction. Raschke explicitly mentions tricksters, and he noted that UFOs are tricksters and that tricksters perform the service of deconstruction. Tricksters abound in both spiritualism and in ufology. Now, Raschke did not mention Derrida by name, but his very first citation was to Carl Jung's book, Flying Saucers. In his introductory note, he suggests that flying saucers serve as portents of great changes in civilization. He covers psychic phenomena, mentioning the work of J.B. Rhine and synchronicity, but also Hermes, the Greek trickster god. All of these in relation to UFOs. Now, Jung's work has a number of parallels with Derrida's. These are at a relatively high level of abstraction, and time does not permit a useful discussion of those convergences. But a few scholars have provided some good insights. Notable are Michael Van Adams and Susan Rowland. Now, before I discuss cleodynamics, I should return to Spectres of Marx. Remember, this book was written in response to Fukuyama's triumphalist work extolling capitalism and liberal democracy. Derrida wrote, "Never, never in history has the horizon of the thing whose survival is being celebrated, the capitalist and liberal world, been as dark, threatening, and threatened." What was he referring to? Was it radical Islam? No. Was it climate change? No. Was it China? No. Was it nuclear annihilation? No. Instead, he identified three indissociable places or apparatuses of our culture. He explicitly labeled them A, B, and C. A, the political class. B, media, teletechnology, economy, and power. In other words, big media, big tech. C, academic culture, the humanities, and social sciences. He wrote, "The politico-economic hegemony, like the intellectual or discursive domination, conditions and endangers any democracy. No one, it seems to me, can contest the fact that a dogmatics is attempting to install its worldwide hegemony in paradoxical and suspect conditions." These words were written 28 years ago, written while contemplating Karl Marx and ghosts. I ask you, are these words prophetic? It's time to address cleodynamics. In 2010, Russian-American Peter Valentinovich Turchin published a short article in Nature, the world's leading scientific journal. He predicted political instability may be a contributor in the coming decade. Turchin is a leading figure in cliodynamics, which applies mathematical modeling to historical trends. Turchin was not the only one showing such foresight. In 1991, 30 years ago, William Strauss and Neil Howe made a similar prediction. With AI and big data, a number of institutions, including intelligence agencies, have implemented cliodynamic projects. Many of these efforts will be kept secret. A lot of money can be made by those who accurately foretell the future. There is little reason for big tech or others to give much public attention to cliodynamics. In July, I'm scheduled to speak at Lilydale, a spiritualist town in western New York, just as I have for the last 6 years. In those talks, I noted that probably most adults today sense that the world is in some kind of transition. There has been a polarizing of political and social views. The Me Too movement, the Trump presidency, the prominence of transgender as a political and social issue, Black Lives Matter. We've been in a state of confusion, instability, and uncertainty for several years. During this period, we've seen growing interest in spiritualism, especially in the arts, and we've seen an enormous increase in mainstream media coverage of UFOs. What can history tell us about similar times in the past? Let's look at the world half a century ago, 67 to 69. Race riots, tanks in the streets of Newark, riots at the Democrat Convention in Chicago, Vietnam War protests, riots in Paris, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy assassinated, USSR invaded Czechoslovakia, Stonewall riots in New York City, the Hong Kong flu pandemic. What's happening now? George Floyd riots, Black Lives Matter, defund the police, transgender activism, talk of secession and civil war, the Me Too movement, COVID-19 pandemic. I think there are some significant parallels. During that time of crisis, we also saw the Silver Bridge collapse, Mothman, Condon Report, 68, MUFON founded, 69, Passport to Magonia, 69, Parapsychological Association accepted for membership in the AAAS, the pandemic wave, 1964 to 68. Now, I just mentioned the pandemic UFO wave of that period. There was also a significant rise of interest in UFOs. Google's Ngram viewer shows the percentage of time a word is used in books. The 60s showed a dramatic spike. And today we are again seeing extraordinary media coverage to UFOs. Now, perhaps foreshadowing that period was the 1961 UFO abduction of Betty and Barney Hill, an interracial couple who were active in the early civil rights movement. At the time, their marriage would have been illegal in a number of states. Their abduction experience is one of the most famous of all time. Though it occurred 60 years ago, a new series is in the works, and a new book on it was released last year by a publisher known for its academic parapsychology titles. By the way, the Hills experienced poltergeist phenomena in their home after the abduction. Also, intelligence personnel expressed considerable interest in their case. Let's look at the world a century ago. In 1917, there was the Spanish flu pandemic. The U.S. entered World War I. Woodrow Wilson had just segregated government service. The Russian Revolution began. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, the women's right to vote. It was a time of considerable change. Also in 1917, there was Fatima, one of the most witnessed and documented UFO cases in history. It included an apparition of a spiritual being, namely the Virgin Mary. The date was foretold months in advance by shepherd children. On October 13th, an estimated 70,000 people arrived to witness the prophesied event. Newspaper reporters and skeptics were in attendance. Early that day, it rained heavily. People were drenched and the fields were wet and muddy. At some point, the sun started to move. It changed color and was reported to move about the sky. There are quite a number of first-hand accounts and books have been published. I found Stanley Jackie's God and the Sun at Fatima of particular use. Today, Fatima is a pilgrimage site. It attracts more than 4 million visitors annually. Ufologists have taken note. Isaac Coy prepared a detailed list giving page numbers of 63 UFO books that discuss the case. By the way, Isaac Coy is a pseudonym, but he's got quite an interesting website. Let's look back at 1848. 1848 was the year of the birth of modern spiritualism, a religion that talks to the dead. Of course, people have been doing that for thousands of years, but in 1848 it became a noteworthy social movement. In the next several years, it attracted the attention of millions of people. Karl Marx mentioned spiritualist dancing tables in Capitol. Seances were held in Lincoln's White House. 1848 was also a year of revolutions across Europe. The American Civil War followed 13 years later. 1848 was also the year these words were penned. A specter is haunting Europe. The first words of the Communist Manifesto. The first line of the foundational document of communism used supernatural language. It is not accident that Derrida frequently invoked ghosts when discussing Karl Marx. That was not simply metaphorical. Well, what are we to make of all this? Well, today we are being told that UFOs are generally considered advanced technology of some type. The paranormal aspects rarely get mentioned. But the paranormal phenomena have been around for thousands of years. Our culture tends to minimize, smirk, and sneer at them. It's been pushed aside. But for thousands of years, people have recognized that the supernatural entailed considerable amount of danger. There were rituals and taboos surrounding them. Those are forgotten today. Luis Elizondo has been kind of disparaging some of the people who raised questions about the religious and moral aspects of UFOs, people like the Collins elite, trying to dismiss them. Those people and people like them deserve to be heard. The fact that we are not being told about this, that the mainstream media is not addressing this, should be cause of concern. And I do hope you will seriously contemplate the prophecy of Jacques Derrida. Thank you.
George, thank you very much. I've got a whole host of questions and comments that I've been kind of queuing up. And I'm sure others are going to have them out there as well. My first comment, and what piqued my interest, your comments about Karl Marx. Very interesting. I mean, his whole life was quite interesting. There's obviously been a lot of, over the years, there's been a lot of allusion to the fact that he was a Satanist. He was accused of Satanism. Also, you mentioned early on in the presentation about Jack Parsons. And of course, Jack Parsons being the founder of JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and his delving into the paranormal to a point where even I think he was asking for help from the CIA for something that he may have kicked off or opened up or something. Have you been following that? Is this part of what you've been talking about?
I read on Jack Parsons years ago. I haven't really thought about him recently, but thank you. That's something I should look into again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, George. Okay, let's open it up. I've got more questions, but let's open it up to the folks out there. Let your imaginations run wild, and there are no wrong questions or wrong answers. So please feel free to share.
I'll go if nobody
Okay,
else
Steve.
is. Hey, George, so you know Jen Porridge, right? Genesis Porridge?
Yes, I know. Yes, I've spoken of him and you've listened to my lecture, I believe.
Yeah. Jen was like, I told you, Michael, my brother-in-law, right?
Yeah.
He was but he just had a show that just went up on Wednesday, up in on the, my friend Benjamin, who was Jen's gallery guy, and you'd be pretty interested in the relation to what this is a guy who's doing silk screens of some Jen photos in terms of the transgender and paranormal stuff. So I would peek into that if you could, if you wanted to. And also, J.G. Bennett wrote Systematics, which was a precursor to, from what I understand, people tell me, a precursor to Cleodynamics. So if you
Oh,
know, but J.G. Bennett was
yes.
worked
Yeah.
with Gurdjieff.
Gurdjieff, yes.
Right.
Thank you. I should look into those.
Okay, I noticed that there was a question from Sirkin to everyone. Do you think the trickster has an agenda that spans multiple generations?
Almost certainly. I think you will see the patterns repeating over and over. Um, I don't think I would phrase it in quite those words, but yes, there are patterns that repeat and may afflict certain families. I would anticipate that.
Okay, thank you.
We have a hand raised by Farusha, if you'd like to go ahead.
Hi, George.
Hello, Farusha.
You mentioned briefly before how there was a very good reason in the Catholic Church why the priests and the nuns are not allowed to marry. And it seemed to have something to do with the danger that they face, maybe even with things like exorcisms, etc. And it sort of circles back to the dangers that any of us might face who are interested or researchers or experiencers of paranormal phenomena. Can you
Okay.
see that?
Yes. The issue of the priests, monks, and nuns not marrying really belongs more in my lecture on liminality theory. I can't really address that very effectively here in this time slot, but people do wonder why. Well, it's not because they want to make a lot of money by not paying out inheritances or that sort of thing. No, there are very deep reasons that those people in those positions do not marry. But that's a little bit, the theory of that would take a little too long to describe.
All right.
Hey, George, in terms of Derrida, have you looked into it? Does he have any relation to occult secret societies or cult groups or anything like that?
No, so other philosophers may have. Derrida looks really very, very clean to me. Uh, people have accused him of being a Marxist. I don't think that's really fair. I think he claims he's neither a Marxist nor an anti-Marxist. I think he's really just doing very interesting philosophy. Uh, so I have not come across anything in the biographical material that I've read that would suggest that there's a connection there. But I very well could have missed something. I don't read French. So if you do come across something, please let me know.
And you're familiar with Craig Baldwin, right?
No.
Oh my God, George. A mock-up on Mu, Spectres of the Spectrum, and his new film was going to be Deconstructionist, but he had cancer a few years ago. If nobody's familiar with Craig Baldwin, amazing filmmaker who is beyond Craig, C-R-A-I-G. He's located in the Bay Area.
Okay.
Craig's amazing.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Redmond, you're up next. And you are muted, sir.
Addressing the question of celibacy among the Christian clergy, specifically the Catholic clergy, I just wanted to add that the Greek Church, the Orthodox Communion, which is as ancient as Roman Catholicism, and maybe even more mystically and liminally oriented than Roman Catholicism, has a continuous tradition of married clergy. I just wanted to toss that in there.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. So I don't really know where we would be going in a discussion of how celibate clergy, liminality, etc., actually works out. So I'm just saying thank you.
Okay, that's a fair comment.
Chantal, you were next. You had your hand up.
And just a real simple question about this priest and the monk and the nun thing. It's the theory of what? What?
Liminality is one of the central issues that I discuss in my book on the trickster and the paranormal.
And
It's
how do you
central.
spell that?
It's the word comes from liminal, which refers to threshold. It's Liminal. Probably the most important work on that would be Victor Turner's book, The Ritual Process. Also, that came out 1969. Arnold van Gennep's book, The Rites of Passage, came out about 1909. It was really the beginning use in anthropology.
Great. Thank you so much. This is something new to me, so I just wanted to make sure I got it. Thank you. Great presentation.
Mr. Knoll, would you like to join in? Unmute, please.
There we go. Hey, George.
Hello, Richard.
Good to see you. Well, this is probably the last question you want. I actually have two, but I'll start with the one that I think might get you going. What is your bottom line opinion of Bob Lazar and his claims?
There is a very good timeline of Bob Lazar's life. I think it's online. It was compiled by a PhD physicist. Can't remember the guy's name, but if you look Bob Lazar timeline, Google, that might come up.
Okay.
And there's all sorts of reasons to think that he was certainly something of a trickster. It's hard to know for sure, but my guess is he was probably profiled and given information with hopes that would be spread. He's an incredibly interesting character from the standpoint of mystery.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he's terribly significant. There's too much ambiguity, but the work that I found the most interesting was that timeline on his life,
Okay.
which raises lots of issues.
Oh, yeah, I'll check it out. Yeah, I just have one quick question. I read Jacques' most recent book, Trinity.
Uh-huh.
And I think you said that you thought there was strong evidence presented in that book for the claims. And I came away with a very different impression. I was looking for something, but there seemed like a lot of filler material in the book. The claims, were kind of like decades old, and not to throw those things out, but there didn't seem to be much to hold on to there in terms of evidence.
Well, there's considerable witness testimony, and then again, if you look at this Ray Stanford's work on the Socorro case, where the metal fragment was stolen from him, that they wouldn't have taken the effort to steal something from Ray Stanford if there hadn't been something else before that that they really wanted. And
Right.
given the location, there may be some kind of portal area. All of these things. Also, if you look at the whole nuclear UFO connection, if you look at Robert Hastings' work, you go
Yeah.
back even to George Adamski warning
Yeah.
about the nukes. I think we have to take the nuclear connection a lot more seriously than we have before, and this clearly does that. I
Yeah.
think there's a growing body of evidence that I had not really paid much attention to. I really respected Robert Hastings for
Yeah.
more than 30 years. So I think that whole angle needs a lot more attention, and this certainly provides some very interesting material on that.
I agree. That I agree. Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
I'll
Anyone
go.
else?
How you doing?
Okay,
Why
Steve.
not? Hey, George, you're familiar with the haunt? Should I go?
Well, you are going. Go ahead.
The hauntological movement in music.
I've read a little bit about it some years ago. I'm not into music or the arts much at all. I rarely listen to music and rarely visit art museums. Um, so I really don't have a lot to say about it. But yes, that's the arts tend to pick up on stuff much earlier than other people do. So it needs to be paid attention to.
Right. Which just also is interesting. Jung in Flying Saucers, how he goes into the art at the end, which is very interesting, right?
Yes, you're
When
right. You're right.
he starts dissecting that, it's great.
Hmm.
There's a hauntologist musician called Gray Frequency who actually has one on ufology. It's called, which is
Oh,
pretty
great.
great. And there's Philip Jack I would recommend, and Caretaker, and those people. And of course, Marianne Amache, always Marianne, Amacher. And Spectralism by Celsi, right? Spectralism.
Yeah, I haven't. I I don't delve into the art scene because there's just so much there. It's really beyond what I can take on. But I do acknowledge that the people in the arts are often in advance of changes and are sensitive to the changes that are coming. Next question.
George, is cancel culture just another name for deconstruction?
No. That can be part of cancel culture, but no. Deconstruction, give about an hour's long lecture on. Much of the stuff I've read, I don't think most people citing Derrida really understand him very deeply, especially when it starts coming to paranormal topics. They kind of skirt around it. They don't address it really directly. It's very, very subtle in how he uses it, and I think very important. Carl Raschke certainly picked up on it 40 years ago, but I don't see anyone else doing anything close to what Raschke came out with.
Well, you haven't explained what deconstruction is. You
No,
just said that it's
I don't have another hour.
Okay.
No, Derrida has a very famous letter to a Japanese friend saying, if you ask what is deconstruction X or Y, is to miss. To ask what deconstruction is to miss the point. So if you're asking it, you're missing the point.
That's a cop out.
No, it's not. It seems to be. It's not.
Well, I must confess that leaves me in the dark. So
Yes,
must be one of the ignorants.
No, that it's very, very subtle. Derrida probes foundations. It's all about foundations. And psychic phenomena, if you look at the parapsychological literature, especially the good theoretical work, it's talking about much the same problems. You'd have to know.
Joe Foster.
I'm sorry.
Joe, is it possible to step in here? This is Mike out in the Poconos.
Oh, yeah, sure, Mike. Go ahead. Answer your question.
A real quick question. How can an uneducated individual, armchair researcher, use the paranormal or psychics to get results and solve problems like, say the cure for the common cold or where the archaeological artifacts are buried? How can these psychics and paranormal gifts be used to get positive, concrete results? Thank you.
Well, there's a whole lot of literature on that, and probably uneducated might even have a bit of an upper hand with that. So don't put yourself down for being uneducated. Those people, the marginal people, the lower class people, are probably going to have a little more close contact with paranormal phenomena. People who are pretty well middle class, probably not quite as much. There's some very good quote by Toni Morrison about talking about why black people have experience with ghosts and the like. So yeah, there's a whole lot of literature on the use of paranormal abilities and the like. It's the nature of those is trickster. They are not fully consistent, and it sometimes can turn back upon the person in unfortunate ways.
I'd like to add an observation here. Those that have been on the previous meetings and presentations probably have heard me say this or alluded to this before. And it'd be interesting to see if anyone agrees with this. In the 40 some years that I've been investigating this, going back to my first non-PBS television news job in Roswell as an anchorman, I have seen in the last couple years in the many people that I know that still do broadcasts and are doing investigative work, a very unique change in attitude, and that relates to the strict line of demarcation between, as your discussion has pointed to, and that is a joining of the concept of paranormal and UFOs are not separate entities, activities, phenomenon, but this amalgamation between the two, which is being looked at in a serious way. And I think it's just very interesting that 4 or 5 years ago, there were a few people, pushing in the boundaries as far as the broadcast, the podcast, the network shows and so forth. But that has ramped up dramatically. And I think you make a very good case of there is an interaction. I mean, this may in fact go back to, the writings of someone like Tesla and so forth, who said that, it was all connected in the ether. Whether you look at the Hopi Indians or a lot of the religious traditions, that maybe there isn't a distinct silo between UFOs and paranormal, which is of course the basis of my understanding of your presentation. But does anybody else see that in the UFO media and the presentations? I know Joe and I have talked about this a number of times.
Well, you certainly see it in Contact in the Desert. They recognize. But as far as the media goes,
well, I don't mean the traditional media, because
okay.
That's pretty much useless in terms of
right. But
any valid.
Yes, if you look at Contact in the Desert, there are 5 or 6 people who are quite prominent within parapsychology that are talking there. So they're within the UFO community. Now, MUFON for many years had an official policy for state directors that they could not speak about psychic aspects of UFOs to the press.
Right.
And parapsychologists really almost never talk about UFOs at their conferences. And at MUFON, as far as I know, they have little or nothing on psychic aspects. That's changed. The rank and the people in MUFON and the people in UFO organizations usually understand that there is a deep connection, but the people up at the top don't want to talk about it.
No, and there's probably many reasons for that, whether it's academic or philosophical or perhaps just turf preservation.
I think it's deeper than that. If you can just describe UFOs as some kind of technology, that's sort of in the rational world. This enters into the liminal realm, the betwixt and the between, the mystical, the supernatural. That realm has very, very different properties, and it
Mhm.
is highly destructuring to society at large. Uh, there are liminal periods in earlier cultures, and those liminal periods were protected by taboos and rituals. And there was usually a shaman who led the tribe or the people through that period. That period was very dangerous. And I think to some degree the skeptics were right in crying out, this is the paranormal is threat to Western civilization. They were basically saying that back in the 1970s when PSYCOP was founded. There is actually a basis for their claims that way. These phenomena are inherently disruptive.
Mhm.
There are reasons that priests go through ritual processes that the rest of us don't, and rabbis and shamans. They live differently. They are kept apart. It's fundamental to the nature of these phenomena. They are inherently other. They are inherently different.
Good point.
If you look on at the news or the email threads concerning the recent disclosures by the Navy on the Tic Tac, the Go Fast, and the Gimbal, there's quite a debate coming out on as to whether or not they are ARVs or ETVs. And one of the things that does not come up in any discussions is the telepathy that the fighter pilots engaged in with these vehicles when they were seeing them. And you're right that the one problem that most people have is they want to make this into a nut and bolt type of explanation. And therefore they say, oh, it has to be Navy, it has to be government, it has to be China or Russia as technology, is that they can't come to grasp the amount of psychic phenomenon that is involved with it.
I'm totally unaware of this. This is very interesting. Where can I go to find out more about it?
I can send you some emails that will get into quite a bit of heavy discussion on this.
Thank you.
Chantal, you want to jump in there? You have your hand up, and then Richard.
Yeah, I am on the program committee for the conference that we're having end of July with the Society for Scientific Exploration and the Parapsychology Association. And we cast the net quite wide by having our thematic being connections, because the COVID thing and things like that. But, we cover all the anomalous topics. And I was really disappointed in the submissions that there was no submission regarding the UFO and the paranormal or the psychism and everything that we've been talking about, because I think it's something that needs to come into the literature more prominently. And the Society for Scientific Exploration, of which I'm on the board of, is some scientists who've really put their careers on the line studying anomalous phenomena. And I actually co-chaired the last conference we had a few years ago, which was also the SSC and the Parapsychology Association. And I would love to see more of a marriage of these topics and people submitting to our journal, the Journal of Scientific Exploration, these types of topics, because they really need to be addressed. So I just wanted to put that out there because just really, we're really trying to develop that broader understanding, and it's academically dangerous, but we do want to encourage it, and we try to provide a safe space for that to happen in a very rigorous and collegial environment.
Well, I don't think it can be collegial. The reward system for science is inherently antagonistic to innovation. Nassim Taleb talks about this rather frequently. If you are expecting a collegial collaboration on these topics, you are seriously misguided and you do not understand the nature of these phenomena.
Okay,
I have
it was incorrect use of wording collegial, but anyway, we really try to keep it in the norms of civility. Okay, if that's a better.
No, that's not a good idea. There is serious incompetence in the SSE. And I can name names. In fact, the SSE and people in that started that organization because they could not get their work published in parapsychology journals because the statistics and methodology was so bad. And I refer specifically to Robert John and Brenda Dunn. Jessica Utz and Betty Markwick have published a paper on that. They are not particularly happy with me. And to be civil and nice. No, if you've got power, you can be nice and civil. If you've got a opinion that does not conform to the standard expectations, they don't want to hear it. And they have been very, very reluctant to satisfactorily referee their journals. There has been atrocious articles in that journal. And if you don't have someone who's willing to stand up and fight that, you're going to have a mediocre or poorer organization. And that's the problem. If you want collegiality, you're in the wrong area. That's the nature of liminality.
We're looking for a new editor, which I think will be very refreshing. So if anybody's interested, it's out there.
But who's the new editor?
We don't have one yet.
Okay.
You, George. Why don't you volunteer?
No, I don't want to be.
I'm stirring a pot. Forgive me.
With a bunch of dimwits.
George, isn't that part of what goes on here? Is that the narrative gets so constrained and restricted, and it becomes, just an echo chamber, and outside thought isn't really allowed in. I mean,
That's often the case. You can certainly see that in psychology and other academic disciplines. But the academic disciplines really claim to be advancing knowledge. No, they're restricting it by their nature. If you want to read some very good stuff on it, Nassim Taleb talks about that. If you want to see someone who really stirs the pot, read Nassim Taleb. Psychologists and others hate his guts, and he is one of the most important public intellectuals today.
And the word of sin is restriction.
Yeah, well, you have to have some restriction. You have to have boundaries. That's the nature of life. But sometimes the boundaries are too strong and should be torn down. Sometimes you need them desperately.
Let's move on to Richard here. He's been patiently waiting. Go ahead and unmute Richard, though, before you speak, because we're not good at reading lips.
There we go. Okay, well, I've been enjoying this, but I met George exactly 40 years ago this summer at J.B. Rhine's lab down in Durham, North Carolina. He was on staff. I was a summer hippie wannabe, floating through. And I've just loved him ever since. And I absolutely respect George, and I go to George whenever I have a question about any of this stuff, because George tells it straight. He's been thinking about this deeply for decades. And I believe his book, The Trickster, on the Trickster and the Paranormal, is a stunning intellectual achievement. I really do. And I go back to that book quite often. Now, in that book and in your presentations, George, you often refer to the fact that, societies have created rituals and taboos and so on to deal with the power of the paranormal, right? For protection or whatever. And I thought about that a lot recently in the last couple of years, but especially the last couple of months, with respect to this unraveling or whatever it is that's going on, with respect to the government and the UAP issue. Is it I thought about this in terms of your basic model. I mean, we talk about the government, but the government's people, it's human beings, right? I mean, just like you and I, they're humans, I hope. They don't act that way sometimes, but I hope. But is the secret too corrosive? Is the frequent contact and focus on these sorts of issues by certain individuals, maybe tucked away in the government here and there, and special access programs? Is the paranormal taking its revenge? Is it going to unravel the whole government? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Is it too radioactive? Are we going to have a huge social upheaval, starting within the government, because of this,
Yeah, I think to some degree, Derrida's prophecy gets to that.
Yeah.
Yes, the appearance of UFOs, Jung says, often marks serious transition. Yes, this is a dangerous time. We don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that the big media and big tech have an enormous amount of power. Getting back to the idea of text and control. Even Marx talked a little bit about media. These issues are very serious, and they're totally ignored within these paranormal fields.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mindy put in a question earlier. I just want to change the direction just a little bit, if I may, and that is she asked if you could just elaborate on your work when you were associated with Princeton, George.
Okay, I worked at Psychophysical Research Laboratories, which was in Princeton but not at Princeton.
Okay.
It was an independent laboratory funded primarily by James S. McDonnell. For I think it was in the lab lasted for 10 years. I was there for the last 5 years. And at the end, we also got some funding from the Fetzer Foundation and a little bit from the government psychic spying program. I don't remember any other funding. I did research on random number generators and mental influence on those. And I also was involved with a telepathy experiment called the Gansfeld, which for a while seemed to have considerable promise for replicating psychic functioning.
Was that in the 1970s?
No, 1980s. I was at there from 1984 to 1989. The PRL was started in 1979, if I recall correctly. Now, Princeton University also had a lab in the basement of the engineering building, and that was overseen by Robert John, at one time dean of the engineering school. That was Brand X. They really didn't know how to do their statistics. You would be surprised, but they really screwed them up. So we had with me. No, Bob, John, and Brenda came over and complained to my boss about me, and my boss said, "Well, if George is wrong, I'll make him change it. But if he's not, he's going to publish." They were not happy. So no, one of my heroes is Nassim Taleb, and people really hate his guts, and I think there should be more people like him.
Anybody else like to unmute and
Hey,
comment?
George, before sorry, is Robert going?
Yeah, may I go, Steve?
Of course.
Yeah, hi, George. This is Bob up in Saratoga Springs.
Oh, Bob, good to see you.
Good to see you, George. Good to hear you. Great presentation. I have a lot going through my mind, but what I think I'll focus on is you were talking about the inability for people to be collegial. And over the past week, Danny Sheehan has been saying that we need to be collegial within the ufological community and not fight with each other. And of course, he is now representing not only the Disclosure Project with Dr. Stephen Greer, but he's also representing Lou Elizondo, because the government, whether it's by intent or whether it's some type of counter espionage psyop going on, they're now attacking Lou Elizondo, saying that they've supposedly deleted all his emails. They're saying that they're going to take away his security clearance. So somehow Lou is cozied up to Danny as his lawyer, and Danny's still representing Greer. Well, I listened to Lou Elizondo being interviewed by, I think his name's James Iandoli, one of the Young Guns, 2 days ago. It was posted yesterday on James's site, and Stephen Greer was taken, literally, there was no collegiality at all. He was not playing by, Lou was not playing by the rules that were set out for the rest of us by Danny Sheehan. I know Danny Sheehan well, I know Lou. And Lou all but called Stephen Greer a domestic terrorist. He said that he falsified UFO sightings with flares. That was not true. Those were UFOs over the ocean. And he was really the most animated I've ever seen him in my life. So I take to heart what you say, that we cannot be collegial because we're going to end up with a big psyop stew on our hands. And God only knows what it's going to be. So I take that. The other thing is I and Dolly showed some printouts from ATIP, and they talked about, one of them was cognitive human interface, which is CE5 contact, which Steve Greer is known for. Certainly wasn't started by Steve Greer. It's an old thing. It's created through resonance and mental telekinesis, telepathy with extraterrestrial spacecraft and whatnot. And Lou was squirming quite a bit when this James Iandoli was asking him all these questions, that he had gotten off something that he since posted today. You can read it. It's stuff that was put out by ATIP and the research projects through the Bigelow. And I also want to say that Bigelow is not the only one who has funded the UFO community. Lawrence Rockefeller funded Bigelow, and Lawrence Rockefeller funded John Mack and other researchers, Bud Hopkins, I can't think of his name right now, David Jacobs. And I want to say Leslie Kane, as you said, you know, she has been very influential. She worked with Stephen Greer, and she left Greer right after 9/11. And her, for what it's worth, her uncle was governor of New Jersey, and he wrote the 9/11
Yes.
Commission report.
It's Tom, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just going to leave it at that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We'll talk later.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we will, George. Thanks.
I'd like to jump in here for a second. A couple of things about the disclosure that's going to take place on the 26th or thereabouts. The problems that Elizondo has, I mean, anything that his security clearance, when he left the government, his security clearance was at that point terminated. Technically, he was not, unless he was still doing official work with the government,
He is.
Right.
he would not have access to.
He's
all
still
the
doing
stuff.
contract work.
Right, and the emails, if you work for the government, the emails are owned by the government. That is, again, part of their security thing. It's always been that way, just as long as they've had email. So, and I also think that what he is able to disclose, if he did have access to the really meaty stuff, all the laws and the rules that apply could be brought down on him, and that it's not pretty. It's like 5 years in prison and $10,000 fine or something like that. So he's got to be very careful what he divulges. If the government divulges it through Public Information Office or something of that nature, then he's covered. If it's not there, he is going to squirm if he's being asked questions that put him over the line and into an area that he's not supposed to be going into. So I just want to throw that out. I mean, I had a top secret clearance, and when you're debriefed and everything, they were quite clear about it. So anyway.
Well, that brings in the question of what is, you know, what is he being allowed to discuss on the fringe, and what is he pushing the limits by coming out publicly? And I quite, Joan, you and I have talked about this. He, you know, the fact that he was allowed to leave and then, you know, blow the whistle on all this stuff is in my mind, it only alludes to the fact that, you know, that's the way that anybody on the other side of on the other side of the wall wants it to happen. There's no way that, you know, he could be a loose cannon running around,
right.
you know,
Right.
like Assange or somebody. I mean, let's face it, he's allowed to do this. So I don't know what the agenda is any better than anybody else. And I don't discredit him or disbelieve him. But man, it's tough to discern what side of the fence these players are working on. And I don't know that there's ever going to be an answer to that. We all know that. But, you know, he's not saying anything that he's not allowed to say, or they would have clamped down on him, you know, like somebody dropped a bulldozer on his head. So, you know, I don't know if anybody agrees with that or not, but that's my take on it.
Bruce, I totally agree with you.
I totally agree with you as well. He would, you know, I think there may be a counterintelligence program within a PSYOP here. Otherwise, they would have come down on him very, very hard. And if you read the media and the mainstream, it's all the same talking points. it's a pretty pathetic
Oh, yeah.
attempt to control the narrative at the very least. My opinion.
I'd like to jump in and to support what Joe said about the declassification and the NDA process. Everything that Joe said is true. What is interesting is that John Greenwald on the Black Vault, through FOIA, did verify that the Department of Defense deleted everything they had in terms of emails, files, everything electronic that Lou Elizondo had within their system. John Greenwald also documented the fact that they did this contrary to the directives and regulations that govern the deletion of such material. From the DoD, of course, there has been quietness about this. But as I said, go to the Black Vault, look it up. It's all there and it's in writing. All right. It is, I'm not taking a position on Lou Elizondo. I'm simply saying that it is very peculiar for the DoD to do this, flying in the face of the regulations that it itself says that it follows, and we'll just leave it there. But as I said, that's not scuttlebutt. That's documented at this point that the DoD did that.
If I may just reinforce, go ahead, Ferruccia. You had your. I'll let some other people up.
I heard something on YouTube. There was a roundtable discussion put together by Alan Steinfeld, which had the lawyer, the gray-haired man. It's just
Danny.
Who?
That would be Dan.
Danny Sheehan. I'm sorry.
Dan, yes.
I was rather impressed by him and how he spoke about what he was planning to do with Lou Elizondo, who I only saw at the MUFON meeting. And my first impression was not one of trust. Now, I could be totally wrong, but my first impression of him was not one that I trusted. However, Danny Sheehan seems to be in the mix to pull out of Elizondo on some level stuff that he doesn't want to talk about. And so that might be in some way telling in the whole situation. And I think of him as the only hope for this quote unquote disclosure, which I don't have much hope of anything happening. But I think throwing Danny Sheehan in the mix might just stir the pot to the extent that we might find something else out. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, if I can make one last statement. First of all, Michael Redmond's correct. I misspoke part of what I said. Government owns the emails, but you're right. They're not supposed to delete them. Those are public record.
Oh, so, unless you're Hillary, she can delete
erroneous in my
Did I say that? I'm sorry.
Okay, the other quick comment that I want to make, George during his presentation mentioned Timothy Green Beckley and the book that he wrote and the work that he's been doing over the years, publishing. In case, for those of you who don't know, Timothy passed away 2 weeks ago, and tonight is his funeral in New Brunswick. So I just wanted to note that Timothy is a stalwart within the UFO and paranormal community here, and at least in the Northeast, but I believe around the country. And we should take a moment to think about him and wish his family well. Okay, George, back to you. Okay,
real quick though, let's let Brian. He's been waiting patiently. Brian wanted to. You want to unmute and.
So thank you. I had a follow-up question for George regarding his work adjacent to the Princeton Anomalies Lab. Having worked somewhat closely with Drs. Jane and Dunn, I was wondering what his opinions were on the research that extended that, largely driven by Dean Radin, and the work with random number generators and operator signals or individual user signatures being surfaced and identified by neural networks early in the late 80s and early 90s. Research that I haven't seen anybody compellingly replicate or extend, but with modern neural network and machine learning capabilities could be greatly enhanced from that original exploratory research.
Okay, excellent questions. I could go on at some length. First of all, if you trust any of Dean Radin's statistics, you better get someone to help you. There are an enormous number of errors going back to 1981 when he first presented. I no longer trust, now I'm sure he's got some of his statistics correct, but there's a whole lot that are just plain wrong. For instance, he assumed that elements of a correlation matrix were statistically independent, did a binomial calculation to determine how many were significant, how many were in there, and was that number significant? That's a completely bogus way of doing it. Radin clearly does not understand some very, very fundamental issues. There are relatively few number of people in the field who realize that. I could name a few, but I won't. And he also did some stuff on signatures. There was all sorts of multiple analysis problems. Also in the pair work, they don't really talk about the people who did not complete series for the dropouts. And that typically, now maybe I've missed it. I'd be, if I'm wrong on this, I'd be very appreciative of being informed that I'm wrong. But typically, I did have some conversations with lab personnel trying to explain to them the problem of dropouts, and they did not seem to comprehend that whatsoever. I did correct Carolyn Watt, who made a similar error, published Nemo Mork published something on that in the Journal of Parapsychology, but that's a very basic issue. So I don't really trust much of the pair work at all because they did not understand really fundamental issues. And Dean Radin, I am extremely skeptical of. I've watched him for 40 years now, and from day one and I have sat down with him in his home trying to explain some of the issues. Literally sat in his home, in his living room, trying to explain it to him. He did not grasp it. That's been my experience. Now, I'm not saying all of it is, but there's enough there that I'm extremely skeptical.
May I circle back to an earlier statement that I made, if that's okay, to reinforce and not to contradict at all the comments made about the removal of the documentation from the National Archives and whatever. I worked with Stephen Schiff out in New Mexico when the GAO went in and looked for the actual documents from Roswell. And they found that illegally, and it was stated in the report in '95, ironically, he got a strange brain cancer and died, I believe, it was brain cancer suddenly after this report was issued. Coincidence, I don't know, you decide yourself. But anyway, all the documentation was apparently, according to GAO, disappeared. This is, I think it's well known now that the mechanism to avoid FOIA requests, and Mr. Greenwald will readily tell you this, is they outboard all the materials to a private corporation, which allows them to circumvent the FOIA requirements. And therefore, the government can honestly tell you that we have no documentation on XYZ, and they don't, because they've handed it over to Lockheed or Brown and Root or Blackwater or somebody else, or Iron Mountain as a private enterprise, and we are not allowed then to access it. So I just wanted to reinforce that, yeah, it's illegal. It shouldn't happen. It does happen. It's a mechanism to get around the Freedom of Information Act and honest requests for information.
Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, the beating the Freedom of Information Act is something they were given. They were given the way to sneak through. The loophole was there. So anyway, we are finishing up. It is now 4:29 and change. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank George for an excellent presentation and stimulating a great discussion. This will be uploaded to YouTube. You'll be able to access it from my website. I'll send that information out. Also, last month we had Jack Sarfati as our guest, and we needed to do some editing on his thing. That will be uploaded within a couple of days as well. So both of those Zoom sessions are going to be there. Bruce, thank you for the great support. Sorry for the technical difficulties to both George and the audience, but we overcame them, and I think it came out pretty well today. So
Yes, thank you all for your participation and your patience. And George, thank you for a very meaningful and very, very educational presentation. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
okay, with that, we're signing off, and
Be safe, everybody.
Have a good one, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you,
everyone.
Joe. Good job. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Have a
Bruce.
good weekend. Bye-bye.
hey, Bruce, we'll catch you later.
All right. Yeah. Hey, but no. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, once we got going, it went really well. Yeah.
Hey, Bruce, how you doing? I did too. I was perfectly thrilled, and I think George was. When he sees it, hopefully you'll like it. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's very knowledgeable guy though. Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. He's got. Well, he's got plenty of hair, so he hasn't been pulling his hair out. Right. Oh, I got some great news. I got a phone call yesterday. Looks like InfoAge is going to want us to be putting on activities, including conferences and things like that for UFOs. And yeah, and my antenna. Yeah, that's major. That is, yeah, I've got to put together a presentation. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I got to put together a presentation for the Princeton professor that runs the whole thing. So yeah, I definitely will. I definitely will, Bruce. Thanks again. Oh yeah, I know. I know. Trust me. I know exactly what to go with, Bruce. So. Oh, I know. I know. Oh. Oh, I know it. Oh, you know, it just goes to prove. Doesn't make any difference. When you have something like that, it's going to be there and it's going to bite you. Oh yeah, exactly. Right, right. Hey, Bruce, we're getting ready to go to Tim's funeral. We're going to be driving up to drive up to New Brunswick. Yeah, but I want to talk with you. I want to talk more with you. There's a whole bunch of. No, that wasn't. No, it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad at all. Yeah, right. You too, Bruce. Thanks for all you do. Okay. I definitely will. Thanks, Bruce. Bye now.